"Get that mutt out of here, Daniel, or I swear I'll put a bullet in the air." The voice cracked through the forest clearing like a whip, carried by Sheriff Walter Greaves, a man hardened by decades of law and iron rules. His hat brim shadowed. His eyes, but there was no mistaking the tension in his jaw as he leveled his warning at the young ranger beside him. Daniel clenched his fists but said nothing, his gaze fixed on the German shepherd who refused to move. The dog, ribs visible, through his coat stood rigid, hackles bristled, eyes fixed on the patch of earth before him. No command, no tug of leash, no shout had moved him from that spot since dawn. The clearing itself was unremarkable at first glance. Pines circled it like sentinels, and shafts of light filtered down in fractured beams. Yet the ground, where the dog stood, seemed disturbed, soil slightly raised, the smell of damp rot carrying faintly through the air. Daniel felt his chest tighten each time he drew near. There was something beneath that earth, something the animal knew and would not abandon. The dog growled low when anyone approached, not with wild aggression, but with a guarded grief, as if protecting a secret too sacred to disturb. "Damn animals wasting our time," Greaves muttered, spitting into the dirt. He motioned for the deputies to spread out, their boots crunching over leaves. Yet each time they came near the clearing, the dog's growl deepened into a steady rumble that froze them in place. Daniel finally spoke, his voice firm. "Sheriff, he's not just stubborn. Look at him. He's guarding something. He's trying to tell us." Greaves shot him a withering glance, but for a moment even he couldn't deny the dog's unnerving persistence. The townsfolk had gathered at the forest's edge, whispers rising like smoke. Old Mrs. Harland clutched her shawl tight, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed older than the clearing itself. "That's where my brother disappeared," she whispered, trembling. 60 years ago, right there. He never came home from these woods." Her words rippled through the crowd, heavy and unwelcome. Stories of vanishings, of children gone without trace, had long haunted the town like shadows swept under rugs. Yet no one had spoken them aloud in years, not until the dog had clawed open the silence. Daniel crouched lower, meeting the dog's eyes. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, voice soft against the tense air. The animal's ears twitched, and, for the first time, his growl faltered, replaced by a sharp whine. He pawed the soil once, twice, his claws raking the earth. Something metallic glinted beneath the disturbed dirt. Daniel's breath caught. He brushed away soil with his hands despite the sheriff's barked protest. What he revealed was not a bone nor a stone, but the corner of a rusted tin box, edges eaten by time yet still intact. The dog stepped back then, sitting firm as if his task was nearly done, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. Greaves stepped forward, but Daniel shielded the box instinctively. "Careful," he said, his voice almost reverent. Together with 2 deputies, they pulled the box free. The weight of it seemed wrong for its size, heavy in Daniel's hands. He opened the lid, hinges shrieking, and inside lay stacks of weathered papers bound in string, brittle photographs of faces long vanished, and beneath them, a tarnished medal inscribed with a name the town had nearly forgotten. Murmurs broke into shouts as older residents pressed closer, recognition and disbelief flashing in their eyes. The dog stood, tail low, gaze fixed on the box as if he too understood the gravity of what had been unearthed. The sheriff's face hardened, though his hand trembled at the sight of the relics. "Close it. Take it back. No good comes from digging. Up old ghosts," he growled. But it was too late. The clearing had shifted, its silence broken, and the town's forgotten wounds forced open again. Daniel's voice shook, not from fear but from a weight he couldn't shake. "Sheriff, this isn't just about ghosts. This dog led us here for a reason. Whatever's buried in these woods, stories, people, truth, it's been waiting to be found." The wind stirred, carrying with it a faint scent of moss and rusted iron, and the crowd hushed as if the forest itself had leaned in to listen. The dog lay down at the edge of the soil, chest rising slowly, eyes closing with a calm resolve. He had brought them here, and now it was up to them to face what lay beneath. The forest clearing seemed to breathe heavier as the box sat open on the grass, its contents pulling the air taut with unspoken weight. Daniel could feel eyes pressing. Against his back from the crowd, people desperate to see yet afraid to step closer. Sheriff Greaves slammed the lid shut with a snap that made the dog flinch. "Enough," he barked, his voice sharp as an axe. "This isn't a history lesson. We've got real problems to deal with." But his attempt to bury the tension only made it worse. Whispers swelled among the villagers, thick with recognition. Names rose and fell like half-remembered hymns. Faces in those photographs were not strangers. They were sons, brothers, and fathers who had vanished without answers decades ago. Daniel looked at Greaves, anger sparking through his usually measured tone. "You can't just close it, Sheriff. People deserve to know what's in here. This isn't just relics. It's evidence." Greaves' gaze hardened, but for the first time, there was a flicker of unease in his expression. The German shepherd rose to his feet again, circling the box once before settling with his paws touching the rusted lid. His eyes held steady on the sheriff as though measuring him against something deeper than authority. From the crowd, Mrs. Harlan's trembling hand reached forward, pointing at one of the photographs Daniel had managed to glimpse before the sheriff shut it. "That's my brother Thomas," she whispered, voice breaking with both grief and rage. "He was only 14. Everyone said he ran away, but I knew. I knew he didn't just leave." Her words spread like fire through the gathered people. Other voices joined in, each layered with disbelief, grief, and anger, as more faces recognized pieces of themselves and their families in the story the dog had unearthed. The clearing that had once been silent now echoed with the collective roar of memory resurfacing after years of silence. Greaves cursed under his breath, tugging at his collar as if it had grown too tight. "Enough of this. You're letting superstition cloud your sense. That dog's nothing more than a stray. He doesn't know a damn thing." But his words landed hollow. Even his deputies shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the box and the sheriff. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low but edged with conviction. "If this is nothing, then why do you look afraid?" The question struck like a hammer blow, leaving Greaves momentarily speechless. The German shepherd's growl rose again, steady and unwavering, as though calling out the sheriff's fear for all to hear. Then, as if guided by instinct, Daniel picked up one of the brittle papers from the box. The handwriting was jagged, ink smeared by time, but the words were clear enough. Accounts of meetings in the woods, lists of names, and crude maps of the town marked with symbols no one immediately understood. The deeper Daniel read, the colder. His skin grew. These weren't just old notes. They were records, detailed accounts of agreements, transactions, and disappearances. A network of secrets stretching back generations, hidden beneath the town's quiet facade. The clearing was not just a place of loss, it was the graveyard of truth itself. The crowd gasped as Daniel's voice cracked while reading aloud a name written across one page: Walter Greaves. The sheriff lunged forward, snatching the paper from Daniel's hand, but it was too late. The name had already sunk into the silence of the crowd. Greaves's face flushed crimson, his hand trembling as he tried to pass off the revelation as coincidence. "My father's name was Walter, too. You think I've got something to do with—" His denial faltered under the weight of the stairs, pressing in on him. Generations of silence were unraveling faster than he could stitch them shut. The dog barked sharply, jolting the crowd as he pawed at the soil again, digging deeper. This time he unearthed more than dirt. A fragment of fabric clung to his claws, faded and rotted, but unmistakably human. Gasps broke out. Some people covered their mouths, others stepped back as though the ground itself might split open. Daniel crouched, lifting the fabric carefully. It was a piece of a shirt sleeve, torn but bearing the faint pattern of plaid. Mrs. Harland collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "That's what Thomas wore the day he disappeared," she cried. The clearing was no longer just unsettling. It was accusatory, demanding answers from those who had looked away for far too long. Greaves tried to rally control, barking orders at his deputies to disperse the crowd, but his voice carried no authority anymore. People no longer listened. Their eyes were fixed on Daniel, on the dog, and on the box that had broken decades of silence. For the first time, the sheriff looked small, cornered not by force but by the truth clawing its way to the surface. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, not out of duty but out of desperation. Daniel's gaze sharpened, a silent warning passing between them. The dog stepped closer to Daniel, teeth bared, as if to stand against whatever darkness the sheriff carried with him. The clearing grew darker as clouds moved over the sun, casting long shadows across the circle of trees. What had begun as a stubborn animal refusing to leave had transformed into something far greater, a reckoning. Daniel felt the weight of every eye on him, every memory unburied by the dog's persistence. "This is just the beginning," he whispered to himself, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. The dog pressed against his leg, steady and unshaken, as though reminding him he was no longer standing alone. The forest clearing had become heavier with each passing hour, as though the trees themselves leaned inward, listening to what was being uncovered. Daniel stood with the box in his hands, the dog's eyes steady on him as though urging him not to falter. Around them, the townsfolk pressed closer, their murmurs filling the air with a nervous rhythm. Sheriff Greaves barked at them to back, away, but his voice no longer carried its usual authority. The sight of the rusted tin box, the scattered photographs, and the forgotten medal had cracked something open in the town's memory. No one could ignore it now. Daniel laid the contents on a flat stone. The photographs showed faces that were eerily familiar. Children who looked like older residents in their youth, a man in a uniform whose name was engraved on the medal, a woman standing before a cabin long since rotted into the earth. "Mrs." Harland pressed a trembling hand to her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. "That's him," she whispered, her voice fragile. "That's my brother, Samuel." Gasps rose around her, and Daniel felt the weight of the revelation settle like a stone in his chest. Greaves tried to dismiss it. "Old pictures mean nothing. Could have belonged to anyone who passed through. We're not about to stir up hysteria over scraps." His words rang hollow, and even the deputies exchanged uneasy glances. The crowd sensed something deeper, something tied not just to Samuel Harland, but to the long chain of disappearances that had plagued the town for decades. The clearing wasn't merely soil and roots, it was a graveyard of secrets. Daniel crouched beside the dog, running his hand through its matted fur. "He knew," Daniel murmured. "He's been waiting to bring us here." The dog's ears flicked back, and for the first time since they'd arrived, his gaze shifted from the soil to the tree line beyond. His body tensed, hackles rising. "Once more." Daniel followed his stare, but the shadows held nothing visible, only the whisper of wind threading through branches. Yet the unease was contagious, spreading quickly among the onlookers. Children clung tighter to their mothers' skirts, and men who prided themselves on steel nerves shuffled uneasily. That was when Deputy Collins, a young man known for his stubborn pride, stepped forward with a shovel. "If there's more down there, we'll find it," he said, jamming the blade into the earth despite the sheriff's barked order to stop. The dog snapped, teeth flashing, but Daniel restrained him with a sharp command. Collins dug furiously, the crowd holding its breath. Within minutes, his shovel struck something solid with a hollow thud. The sound rippled through the clearing, colder than the wind. Collins dropped to his knees, scraping away soil until a wooden lid emerged, its boards splintered and swollen with age. Gasps erupted, and Mrs. Harland staggered back, clutching her chest. "Dear God," she whispered. "It's true." Daniel's heart pounded. The wooden lid was no simple crate. It was a coffin. Greaves forced his way forward, face flushed, veins bulging in his neck. "Cover it back up," he roared, his voice cracking under a weight it could no longer bear. "This goes no further, do you hear me? Not one more word leaves this clearing." But his order fell on deaf ears. The townsfolk's fear had shifted into something sharper: anger. For decades they had lived with whispers, with children warned, away from the forest, with missing faces never explained. Now proof lay before them, undeniable and raw, and the sheriff's insistence on silence rang like complicity. Daniel's hands shook as he knelt by the coffin, brushing dirt from its edges. "Sheriff," he said, his voice firm, "if you knew about this, if you kept it buried—" He stopped himself, the implication too heavy to finish aloud. The sheriff's eyes darted from face to face, his silence damning. The dog whined and pressed its nose against the lid, pawing once as though demanding the truth be faced. Daniel pried at the softened wood until it splintered under his grip. The smell that escaped was not the sharp sting of rot, but something different, something preserved by time and secrecy. Inside lay not bones, but bundles of sealed envelopes, hundreds of them stacked like bricks. Daniel pulled one free, the paper brittle yet intact, and read the name scrawled across it. His breath caught. They were letters, each addressed to families in town, families who had lost someone in the woods. The crowd erupted in disbelief. People surged forward, reaching for the letters, crying out as they recognized the names of fathers, mothers, children. Each envelope was a ghost returned, a message that had never reached its home, and all of it had been buried deliberately, hidden away beneath this soil. The sheriff's face turned ashen. His hand went to his holster, not to draw but to steady himself, as though the weight of the weapon was the only anchor left. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. The truth was already spreading, faster than any denial could stop. Daniel stood, holding the letter aloft for all to see. "This clearing isn't cursed, it's been silenced, and this dog, he's broken that silence." His words echoed through the trees, and the dog let out a single bark, sharp and final, before settling into the dirt again, eyes half closed as though his duty was done. But Daniel knew the twist had only just begun, because if the letters had been hidden, if the sheriff had fought so hard to keep them buried, then the question that now clawed at everyone's heart was clear. Who had written them? And why had the truth been sealed beneath the earth for so long? The box sat heavy in Daniel's hands, its rusted corners staining his fingers with flakes of red-brown. Around him, the clearing pressed close, the townsfolk holding their breath as if the forest itself demanded silence. Sheriff Greaves barked. For order, his voice snapping through the murmurs, but the command felt hollow. Every eye was fixed on the box, every heartbeat straining toward the secret it contained. Daniel untied the string around the brittle stack of papers and unfolded the first page. The ink had bled with time, but the handwriting was clear. Confessions, names, dates. Each line was a wound reopened, each sentence a tether binding the town to a history it had chosen to forget. The dog stirred beside him, whining low as Daniel read the first name aloud. It was not just any name, but that of a man. The town still praised in plaques and speeches, a founding figure whose memory was preserved as spotless. Gasps tore through the crowd, a woman's hand flying to her mouth as if the air itself had turned poisonous. Greaves lunged forward, snatching the paper from Daniel's hands, his knuckles white. "This is nothing but old lies," he snarled, though his voice cracked with strain. He crushed the page in his fist as if destroying it could erase the truth. But Daniel saw the sheriff's eyes dart nervously toward the older villagers, those who trembled as though the words confirmed fears. They had buried for a lifetime. The box yielded more than paper. Beneath the brittle letters lay black and white photographs, edges curling, faces staring back with hollow eyes. Children gathered in the woods, men with shovels, shadows cast against the clearing where they now stood. Daniel's stomach turned. cold as he realized the photographs were not of strangers but of the town's own bloodlines, grandparents, uncles, men who had been pillars of respectability. The crowd swayed as recognition spread, an older man whispering a name before collapsing to his knees in the leaves. The dog barked sharply then, jolting the silence, his body tense as though urging them to look deeper, to not turn away. And there it was, the twist that tightened the noose. At the bottom of the tin, beneath the metal, lay a smaller envelope sealed in wax. Daniel pried it open with trembling fingers, his breath catching as he unfolded the single sheet inside. This was no confession. It was a map, a crude sketch of the forest, paths marked with symbols, and a circle drawn firmly around the very clearing where they stood. Alongside it, scrawled in hurried ink, were 4 words that dropped like stones into the stillness. Do not dig deeper. Chill rippled through the crowd, fear pressing against them with suffocating weight. For a moment no one spoke, only the sound of leaves shifting in a sudden gust of wind. Sheriff Greaves stepped back, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "That's enough," he snapped, though his voice was barely more than a rasp. But Daniel could feel the pulse of the forest, a thrum beneath his boots, as though the ground itself resented the command. He met the sheriff's eyes and saw not anger, but fear, the kind of fear that belonged to a man who knew more than he wanted revealed. The dog rose then, circling the disturbed soil with sharp, deliberate steps, pausing at one spot where the earth looked slightly sunken. He barked once, sharp and urgent, his paw striking the ground as if to say, "Here." The crowd recoiled, torn between dread and curiosity. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, his hand tightening on the shovel one of the deputies carried. The decision hung thick in the air, whether to obey the warning etched into the map or follow the dog's relentless insistence. The forest seemed to lean closer, waiting. The shovel broke the earth with a dull thud, each strike echoing in the clearing like a drumbeat no one wanted to hear. Daniel's arms shook as he dug, sweat mixing with soil on his skin, but he did not stop. The dog stood close, silent now, his gaze locked on the darkening hole as if he had carried this moment in his bones all his life. The townsfolk pressed closer, faces pale, breath shallow, their whispers rising with every spadeful of earth. Even Sheriff Greaves had fallen quiet, his authority crumbling beneath the weight of what was unfolding. The warning on the map had not been enough to still the truth. The ground itself seemed to demand it. Then the shovel struck wood. The sound was hollow, muffled, final. Daniel froze, his chest heaving, and the crowd gasped as if one breath had escaped them all. Carefully, with the help of 2 deputies, he cleared the soil until the outline of a box emerged, larger and deeper than the tin they had uncovered before. Its lid groaned as they pried it open, releasing a stale, heavy air that carried the scent of decay. Inside lay fragments of cloth, small bones fragile as glass, and trinkets that once belonged to children. A broken doll, a shoe far too small for the weight of this silence. A woman screamed, collapsing into her husband's arms while others turned away, unable to bear the sight. The forest clearing was no longer just earth and trees. It was a graveyard that had held its secrets too long. Daniel's throat closed as he stared at the remains, but his hands trembled not with fear, but with grief. The papers in the first box had been confessions, but these bones were proof that spoke louder than ink. The town's revered ancestors, those celebrated in speeches and statues, had buried not only children but their shame here in this soil. The photographs were no longer just blurred faces. They were accomplices. The dog whined low, bowing his head, as if mourning for lives stolen before he was ever born, yet carried within his instinct to uncover. Sheriff Greaves stepped forward, his voice breaking into the charged silence. "Enough. Close it. This will destroy everything." But his words carried no weight now. The townsfolk turned their eyes on him, and in them, Daniel saw the flicker of realization. Greaves knew this secret, had guarded it, perhaps even inherited. The silence passed down like a poisoned heirloom. His authority collapsed under the truth, and in that moment the forest felt larger than him, larger than the law he thought he embodied. Daniel knelt beside the open grave, lowering his head. "They deserve to be named," he said softly, though his words carried through the clearing. "They deserve to be remembered, not hidden." One by one, the older villagers began to weep, names breaking from their lips, fragments of memory resurfacing in voices that trembled with guilt and sorrow. The weight of silence, carried for generations, cracked open like the soil beneath their feet. It was not vengeance the forest demanded, but acknowledgement, not punishment, but remembrance. The dog, his work complete, lay down on the grass, his eyes reflecting the fading light. He had refused to leave the clearing until the truth was unearthed, until the bones of the forgotten were seen. Now, with the weight of history exposed, he rested, not triumphant, but at peace. Daniel reached out and touched the animal's fur, whispering, "You brought us here for them." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, the crowd stood in reverent silence. The air was heavy with grief, but also with a strange, fragile clarity. The forest no longer seemed haunted, but watchful, as though it had been waiting for this reckoning. The wind stirred, scattering leaves. Across the open grave, carrying the scent of pine and earth, the truth had been dug from silence, and though it would scar the town, it would also free it. The last image burned in every heart that left the clearing was not of bones or boxes, but of the dog lying quietly by the disturbed soil, a silent guardian, who had refused to leave until the buried voices were finally heard.